It will help us very much along our way if we remember something that got somewhat of a mention early on in our time with each other, but we didn't stress a great deal. And that has something to do with how Kant launched a certain way of looking at philosophy. If you'll remember, Kant said that there were limited things that philosophy could accomplish, but he did also say that to be fully human, we had to ask certain questions and fundamentally wonder about certain things. It turns out, curiously, that if we were to date the beginnings of philosophy as an academic profession and think of it as something that belonged in an academy, a college, a university, a separate department, a separate discipline, well, that more or less begins with Kant. And it's important that we take note of that because professional philosophers, and I say that with a great deal of respect, thought that the discipline of philosophy needed to have its own particular subject matter. And that subject matter turned out to be concepts. And the technical analysis and development of concepts by very gifted intellectual people turned out to be the direction in which philosophy went as a profession. And it's a very engaging profession. But in certain ways of looking at the matter, its interests are narrow. Hegel, curiously, who we've thought about a great deal and reflected on, is someone who doesn't quite fit that mold, or at least is not accepted altogether in that mold, at least outside of the European world. And probably in many ways, Hegel's most known as the guy whose ideas were rejected by Marx, but Marx was indebted to Hegel, and Hegel is viewed probably for ill as the generator of Marxism. Well, this idea that philosophy is not just a technical discipline, but it should guide us or offer us guidance with respect to living. The idea that philosophy should help us in the art of living is an idea, though we saw it in Kant, we come to see it more and more later in our story. Remember that I had mentioned to you that John Dewey made the claim that philosophy's only valuable if it stops dealing with the problems of philosophers, turns its attention to the problems of human beings. Well, it is not quite true that philosophy isn't valuable as a technical discipline, but the core of it we wish to look at is that core of it that concerns ways of living. Because the real purpose of philosophy, after all, could also be to change our lives, to make it possible for us to view life differently. After all, that's a challenge, isn't it? Because we think of religion as a private, personal thing. And do we really want to pretend to wisdom and say, well, someone that studies philosophy could be wise enough to suggest ways to change people's lives? That's something we all have to think about as we listen to what these philosophers tell us. It is a great kind of matter of concern whether this enterprise is one that has the value we hope it does. Now, we're thinking a great deal about Nietzsche at this moment, and when Nietzsche came to see Plato's true world as a fable, as something made up, his notion of philosophy's task turned in a provocative, even an iconoclastic direction. The notion of truth has sometimes been conflated with that of a mighty power. And that's the idea that the truth is mighty and that it'll prevail. And fusion with or obedience to that power then got to be believed as what would liberate one or save one. And in fact, in Plato, that part of us that's highest would unite with that mighty power. It would unite with the forms and the good. And since the highest in us is reason, the relationship that would be the united one and uniting one would be a rational one. And to know this truth and to conform to it and to act in accordance with it on Plato's view, well, that's to know reality, to know the good. And on Plato's account, if you act in accordance with what you know to be the good, then that is the good life. And you are in touch with reality, and you are living as you should. And your moral goodness will quite automatically follow. Let's look at this further. Within the Christian appropriation of Plato, especially in St. Augustine, something's added that complicates matters, that there may be something in us that's flawed, our will. We may in some important ways be viewed as sinful, and that we may not be able to, even if we got glimmers of this overarching truth, act in accordance with it, correlate with it. And in varying forms throughout the history of Western thought, it's been thought some special something might be needed to unite us with the truth. And that's often in religion been called grace, a gift from the beyond. And its purpose is said to be to connect us with reality. And then perhaps, and only then, we'll be set free. But if philosophy is our guide to living, it's not clear that we can talk about grace as a means of accomplishing these things. You know, often in the philosophical world, moral and behavioral prerequisites are in place as conditions for the attainment of truth. In Plato, there's an entire educational system that's put in place in order to train us and to elevate us to the point where truth would be available. And as I've been sharing with you all along, in this account, assumptions are made regarding that higher nature we might have, and that for the attainment of truth, we must find and develop that higher nature. And generally in philosophy, with Descartes and modern philosophy, there aren't moral requirements for the discovery of truth. What's needed is a sort of power and discipline of mind, and that becomes the sole virtue, what's primarily needed in the quest for truth. Truth remains, after the Greeks, in the modern period, in the 17th and 18th centuries, it remains something objective and capable of being found, but reality, whether scientific or metaphysical, doesn't necessarily, in the modern period, any longer provide a basis for determining moral action. In the modern period, the last 400 years or so, science ascends over metaphysics. That's the legacy of Kant, really, in a way. And therefore, we don't have the same basis for action found in the world. If it's a world beyond us, as Plato talked about, there could be a basis for action because reality provided it. But it is seen more in our contemporary world that reality itself, however the world is, it doesn't tell us just exactly what to do. And with biotechnological possibilities, we even wonder in our time whether it's not so much a matter of finding the truth about reality as changing reality. And it may be in our power more and more in the 21st century to do that. Because the concern, after all, not to violate something's nature, well, that's kind of problematic, isn't it? Once the notion that something has a nature that we couldn't do anything about anyway has been stripped away. The world of what we could call self-instrumentalization has now been entered. And one's own personhood in our 21st century may well become an object of potential manipulation. Somewhat inconsistently in his writings, Nietzsche construes the true as that interpretation which is life-affirming or life-enhancing. And the untrue for Nietzsche, not a mighty power, not the world the way it supposedly is, the untrue for Nietzsche is that which denies life, which does not promote growth. Truth is whatever promotes growth. The false is that which impedes growth. Now that's a very unusual notion of true, that it promotes your growth. And it's a very unusual notion of the false, that it denies your possibilities for growth. It doesn't sound in a hard-headed way objective, and it doesn't sound anywhere near in a transforming way life-changing. But that's what Nietzsche wants. If God is dead, if we have nothing but interpretations, let us take those interpretations that enhance our opportunities, that promote our growth. Let's take those interpretations, call them true. True equals promoting growth. Let's take those interpretations that in a way diminish or deny us our energy and opportunity. Let us call them false. Now for Nietzsche, and we've already thought about this a bit, on that account, standard Western metaphysical and religious doctrines are untrue because they deny life. They deny the embracing of this world in the name of what Nietzsche thought was a fictional world beyond this one. And in fact, if we're to believe Nietzsche, these doctrines that we inherit as our Western axial tradition, they exhort us to negate the natural, the instinctually based life of becoming that we live out or could live out in this world if we were free of illusions about another world. Sometimes Nietzsche has been categorized as a philosopher of life. And Nietzsche puts an extraordinary emphasis on embracing and cultivating instinctual energy, to find a way, unlike Schopenhauer, to say yes, absolutely yes, to the forces and energies of life, and not even to moralize about them and categorize them into energies that we approve of and energies that we disapprove of, energies that are moral and those that are allegedly immoral. Again, for Nietzsche, the true is going to be that which enables us to affirm life in its totality. The dangerous, the dynamic, even the so-called evil and the cruel. That which enables us to say yes to all of this, in fact, without qualification. Now, that's an extraordinary claim. Nietzsche knows it's extraordinary, and he's well aware that it's something that may take us a long time to absorb and that most people will be unwilling to take seriously and allow themselves to absorb. Then for Nietzsche, if you aren't able to do that, you will be living in the untrue, that is to say, in a kind of netherworld of allegiance to things that don't promote your growth, that are life-denying, that leave you in what we referred to in our last lecture about Nietzsche as a wasteland in which we have no inner life of substance, and our external life isn't one in which we embrace reality. This, for Nietzsche, if we have that wasted and wasteland type of experience, brings about something called nihilism. It means the devaluation of values and an ensuing decadence and a sense of emptiness. If we're to believe Nietzsche, the values that grow out of life denial, out of illusions of a higher and better world, they've no longer been sustainable by us. We can't quite absorb the fact that those values don't work anymore, but they don't, and we can't sustain them, and we can only pretend that we are sustaining them. So Nietzsche should be viewed, if as nothing else, as in this respect a critic of what he takes to be a decadent Western culture that gives lip service to beliefs about religious reality. Enough lip service that a full life in this world isn't embraced, but little more than that. What Nietzsche wants to champion is creative affirmation and a shaping, especially a shaping of oneself. Let's dwell on this for a moment because it's something of great significance in Nietzsche's writing. Nietzsche is saying that there could be one great work of art. That work of art would be ourselves. We would find a way to release our energies, to embrace them, and then to shape them. So, as he says in one place, the great act of the Creator is that Creator creates him or herself by a constant release and shaping of energies. The escape from nihilism is to make yourself your own project and to use your energies and your creative shaping capacities to be a continually changing, self-reinventing, creative, energetic human being. And Nietzsche doesn't think many people will have the courage, the capacity to do that, but he speaks to the few who he thinks will have that capacity. We should turn to Nietzsche's distinction between master and slave morality. It's very fundamental and important in Nietzsche, and it's a kind of key to the complex directives in his thought that constitute his notion of how we would guide our lives, what we might do to develop better the art of living. He makes this distinction between master and slave in such a way as to claim that the so-called slavish orientation justifies projects and actions through antecedent laws and rules. The slave morality, which Nietzsche thinks most of us live out in our lives, is very reactive, very conformist. The laws and rules of the slavish mind tend toward asceticism. Asceticism is a priestly means of seeking dominance over the strong, the life-affirming, and the healthy. What the slave mentality says is, I do things because they're right. And if you have all kinds of moral rules, then there are all kinds of things that are wrong and you don't do those. But you're always reacting to a set of rules or commands outside of you. The masterly orientation, and Nietzsche extols the masters, generates rules and laws virtually as an afterthought. The master just does things and makes up afterwards rules that justify what the master does. The master is creative and robustly affirms, shapes, renews, develops the master's life, creatively celebrates it. And if anyone says, oh, but what are the rules in accordance with which you're doing this? The master mind doesn't say, oh, well, here are the rules. The master mind says, well, I don't know. I did what I did. Let's see if there's some rules that explain it. It doesn't matter. What matters is this affirmation. Now, applied to society, a literal application of master morality may have some alarming consequences. If you justify something afterwards and say its justification is you did it, in the world in which we live happily, I think you could in some cases go to jail. That is to say, master morality in the whole of society where rules come afterwards is going to create perhaps chaos, but in any case is going to get a very difficult situation in our midst. Nietzsche's account, and there's controversy over it, is probably best applied to the creative activities that occur in the realm of culture. And that's something that's referred to as the interpretive strategy of the so-called gentle Nietzscheans. Let me dwell with that for a moment with you. You see, there are some people that say Nietzsche wasn't interested in the political world. Nietzsche wasn't interested in the larger world. Nietzsche was interested in getting people not to be imitators, not to be just parts of traditions where poetry, this and the other thing was done. Nietzsche was interested in releasing a kind of a talent where people would do things that are new, creative, unique. And those people couldn't go by rules that already existed because those rules already would circumscribe what you could do. What Nietzsche said is that the truly creative spirit, and that would be best manifested in culture, would be a spirit that would look for rules later and elsewhere. But that creative spirit, in that sense, couldn't be the spirit of someone that disregarded rules in the larger society. This is best for the special, separated individual. There are two prime notions in Nietzsche. One is the notion of the Übermensch. First, that got translated into English as the Superman. Now, that didn't work well because there were comic books, and there was Clark Kent, and there was Superman. And Nietzsche's notion of the Superman led you to believe that maybe lurking around every corner, there was someone that would go into a telephone booth and take off clothes, and then you'd see the Superman outfit. And therefore, sometimes this notion of the Übermensch gets called the Overman. Now, that has this advantage. It's hard to know what could be meant by that, so it doesn't cause offense. But we'll keep in mind as we move forward that Nietzsche has the notion of the Übermensch, and I'll be saying something about that in just a moment. He also has the notion of the eternal return. The eternal return is his alternative to other worldliness. It's his alternative to that axial world in which supposedly God resided. If God is dead and there is no belonging we could have elsewhere, then Nietzsche says the alternative is the notion of eternal return. But let's say first something more and try to clarify the Übermensch, the Superman, the Overman. What Nietzsche thinks the ideal for us would be is that we would accept challenges and that we would overcome them, and we would welcome challenges and move forward toward them. We wouldn't submit to them, and we wouldn't define them and construe them in their own terms. To be an Übermensch is not just to overcome problems, it's to seek out and define on one's own terms what those problems might be. And antecedent definitions of what problems could be are construed as consequences of weakness, passivity, slavishness, a failure of imagination. What Nietzsche gives us is the notion that either we can overcome by seeking out and defining in our own terms challenges, or, and this is a play on words that works better in German than in English, we could go under. That is to say, we could go under in the sense there would be challenges there. We might even be forced to confront them, but rather than overcoming them, we would go under because of them. And is Nietzsche's claim that what we ought to do is always to seek out these challenges, take the risk of not overcoming them, take the risk of going under, but define the challenges on our own terms and try as a consequence of that to experience growth. Never, Nietzsche says, should we ever become too old for our victories. And our victories are always in terms of challenges. Let me put this in another way. Remember we talked about Apollo and Dionysius? We talked about energy and the shaping of energy. Nietzsche says, always think of your life as an energy and a capacity to shape it, and that will happen in situations that you can, to some extent, choose and define on your own terms. In his writings, Nietzsche tells us that the most difficult doctrine that he presents in his way of providing an alternative to the world of God or the kingdom of heaven, that the hardest doctrine he presents is his alternative to that, and he calls it the doctrine of the eternal return. What it involves is saying yes to the totality of life. This view has often been misunderstood. Sometimes it's thought that Nietzsche holds this view. If time is infinite and matter can't be destroyed and everything is made up of bits of matter, then everything that's happening now, if time is infinite and matter is never destroyed, is going to happen again and again and again. It's a kind of strange, mythical-sounding scientific view. That is not the view that Nietzsche forwards. Nietzsche forwards the view that if we were to be fully human and fully embrace life, we would say yes to life in the following way: that the life we have now, and if we take a moment to look back briefly at bits and pieces of it, and be sure to look at bits and pieces also that were painful, that brought suffering to us, that perhaps in many ways we regret. Nietzsche says that if we are to experience what he means by and come to embrace the doctrine of eternal return, what we would be embracing is the notion that this life, as it has been, not only with its joys, its opportunities, its celebrations, but also with its horrors, it was precious enough that we would be willing to live it an infinite number of times. We could say yes to it, not yes in spite of the fact that this happened a few years ago, but yes to all of it. And not only that, we'd say yes to it to the point of saying, this life, this is my life, I would take it, not just as it is, but I would embrace living it again and again and again and again. I occasionally mention this in my classes at the end of a talk to give to my classes, that if they really believe Nietzsche's doctrine, they should say altogether yes to their lives. And since part of their lives has been listening to my lecture that day, they really, if they're going to be Nietzschean, must embrace the idea that they will hear this, my lecture, an infinite number of times going into the future. There are various reactions to this, and I won't go into them at any great length. Let me review now for a moment with you what Nietzsche has led us to if we have allowed him to take us by the hand. He has led us to a stance whereby we experience that what world there is this world in which we find ourselves. He's led us to think that the values that matter aren't predetermined by any moral system. The values that matter are the ones that can engage us, and we engage them in such a way that we will grow. And by grow, he means release energy and find new and different ways to shape our life and our experience in the world. He's not concerned to make new things. He's concerned to make things new. And you make things new if you let yourself see the world around you differently. But to see the world around you differently, you cannot just react to it. You cannot look at it just through the spectacles of convention. You must find a way to come to have new eyes and a new vision. And Nietzsche frankly tells us that it's the rare individual who will be able to do this. But his claim, as Kierkegaard's claim, is that it's the rare individuals that matter that somehow must be reached. And if philosophy is to be a guide to living, the only people it can finally speak to are these people. Is this a healthy view? Maybe not. Maybe it's a sick view. It just turns out that when we're together again, we'll be talking about Dr. Sigmund Freud. And we will reflect on something very specific that Dr. Sigmund Freud said about Nietzsche.